The bullet that would change everything was already spinning through the morning air when Clara Whitmore stepped onto her schoolhouse porch, clutching a worn copy of Leaves of Grass against her chest like armor. She didn't see it coming. The lead ball that splintered the doorframe inches from her temple didn't hear the thunder of hooves until dust devils were already dancing across the schoolyard. What she heard first was silence. The terrible, hollow silence that swallows small. "Towns when death comes calling, get back inside." The voice cracked like a whip across the prairie. "Now!" Clara's fingers found the splintered wood, traced the fresh groove where her life had nearly ended. 23 years of breathing, and she'd never felt each one so keenly. The consumption had been eating her lungs for months now, stealing her. Breath in silver-dollar chunks. But this was different. This was immediate. The rider emerged from the dust cloud like something torn from a fever dream. Hat pulled low, bandana masking all but those eyes, pale as winter sky, and twice as merciless. His horse, a black stallion that seemed to breathe smoke instead of air, pawed the ground with restless energy. I said, "Get inside, schoolma'am." You can almost taste the fear that hangs in the air like copper pennies on your tongue. Clara had taught herself to read men the way she read her students' compositions, looking for the truth beneath the scrawled surface. This one wrote his story in violence, in the way his hand never strayed far from his colt, in the fresh blood on his knuckles that hadn't quite dried. "The children," she began. "Ain't no children here, just you and me and whatever reckoning I got coming." He was right. Summer had emptied her one-room schoolhouse of its usual chaos. No Mary Elizabeth practicing her letters, no young Thomas whistling through the gap in his teeth. Just Clara and her books and the ghost of her own mortality that had been whispering in her ear for weeks now. The outlaw dismounted with fluid grace, spurs chiming against the ground like funeral bells. Up close, she could see he was younger than his voice suggested, maybe 30, with the kind of weathered handsomeness that spoke of too many nights under hostile stars. A scar ran from his left temple to his jaw, telling stories his mouth would never speak. "What's your name?" The question surprised even her. He paused, one boot on the schoolhouse step. "Why?" "Because I'm about to die with you, and I'd prefer not to meet my maker in the company of a stranger." Something flickered behind. Those winter eyes, amusement maybe or respect. "Jake Morrison, though most folks just call me Deadeye." "Clara Whitmore," she coughed, tasting copper, "though most folks just call me Miss Clara." "Well, Miss Clara." He touched the brim of his hat with mock courtesy. "Reckon you and I are about to get better acquainted than either of us planned." The sound of distant hoofbeats reached them then, faint but growing stronger, like approaching thunder. Jake's hand moved to his gun, and Clara saw something she hadn't expected. Fear. Not the clean, simple fear of death, but the complicated fear of a man who'd done terrible things and was finally running out of places to hide. "How many?" she asked. "Enough." He was already moving, herding her toward the schoolhouse door. More than enough. Inside, the familiar smell of chalk dust and linseed oil couldn't quite mask the metallic scent of blood that clung to him like cologne. Clara's desk sat at the front of the room, neat stacks of papers waiting for students who might never return. On the blackboard, she'd written yesterday's lesson. "The pen is mightier than the sword." Jake saw it too. Laughed. A sound like breaking glass. "Your pen ain't gonna stop what's coming, schoolma'am." Clara moved to her desk, fingers trailing across the scarred wood surface. Her grandmother's Bible sat in the bottom drawer, alongside her father's letters from the war, and a daguerreotype of the man she'd planned to marry before the consumption changed everything. "Maybe not," she said quietly. "But it might change." What comes after? The hoofbeats were closer now, accompanied by the jingle of spurs and the creak of leather. Jake moved to the window, peering through the gap in the curtains, like a caged animal testing the bars of his prison. "They'll be here soon," he muttered. Sheriff Dobbs and his boys. Been tracking me for 3 days straight." "What did you do?" He turned from the window, and for a moment the mask slipped. She saw the boy he'd been before violence made him into something else, before whatever wound had carved out his heart and left it bleeding. "What didn't I do?" The mask slid back into place. Bank robbery, cattle rustling, shot a man in Dodge. City who probably didn't deserve it. Probably. He was cheating at cards. Had it coming, but Jake shrugged. His wife didn't think so. Clara opened her Bible, pages falling to a familiar passage. "What profiteth a man if he gain the whole world but lose his soul?" "Reckon I lost that particular item some time ago, Miss Clara." Outside, the hoofbeats had stopped. In the sudden quiet, Clara could hear her own heartbeat keeping time with Jake's shallow breathing. Two people about to die, and neither quite ready for the judgment that awaited. "Well then," she said, closing the Bible with a soft snap, "I suppose we'd best figure out how to find it again." But before Jake could answer, Sheriff Dobbs' voice boomed across the schoolyard like the voice of God himself. "Jake Morrison! You're surrounded! Come out with your hands up and we'll make this quick." Jake's laugh held no humor, just the bitter edge of a man who'd already written his own epitaph. "Quick! That's Rich coming from Dobbs." Clara moved to the window beside him, careful to stay in the shadows. Through the thin curtains, she counted 6 riders arranged in a rough semicircle around the schoolhouse. Sheriff Dobbs sat his horse in the center, a bear of a man whose reputation for brutality had reached even her quiet corner of Kansas. "He's not known for his mercy," she whispered. "Mercy." Jake tested the word like it was foreign on his tongue. "When's the last time you saw that particular virtue in these parts?" Before she could answer, Dobbs' voice boomed again. "I know you can hear me, Morrison. You got 5 minutes to come out peaceful-like, or we're coming in after you." Clara watched. Jake's hands, as he checked his weapons. A practiced ritual, muscle memory carved deep by too many similar moments. 2 Colts at his hip, a rifle leaning against the wall, and a knife she glimpsed when he shifted his coat. Armed for war, but surrounded by primers and arithmetic books. "How many bullets?" she asked. He gave her a sharp look. "Why?" "Because I can count, Mr. Morrison. 6 men outside, and you're just 1. Even Dead-Eye Jake can't shoot them all before they shoot back." A coughing fit seized her then, violent and wet. She pressed her handkerchief to her mouth, knowing without, looking that it would come away spotted with blood. The consumption was winning its slow war, claiming territory inch by inch. Jake watched her with something approaching concern. How long? Months, maybe weeks. She folded the handkerchief carefully. "The doctor in Abilene wasn't optimistic. And you're still teaching. What else would I do? Let fear rob me of what time I have left." Clara moved to her desk, pulled out a small derringer from the top drawer. "Besides, someone has to keep the barbarians from the gates." Jake stared at the tiny gun in her pale hands. "You know how to use that thing?" "My father taught me. Said a woman alone needed to know how to protect herself." She checked the chambers with the same careful efficiency he'd shown with his own. "Weapons. I never thought I'd need to use it in my own schoolhouse. Life's funny that way." Jake moved to the back window, assessing their options. "Always gives you what you need right when you can't use it." Outside, she could hear the deputies talking among themselves, the low murmur of men planning violence. One of them laughed, and the sound made her skin crawl. "They won't just shoot you," she said quietly. "No, Dobbs likes to make examples. And probably string me up from that oak tree by the creek. Let me dance a little before I go." Clara looked out at the tree he meant, a massive old oak that had shaded generations of her students during their lunch breaks. The thought of it being used for such a purpose made something cold settle in her stomach. "There's another way." Jake turned from the window. "What?" "You could surrender. Face trial. Maybe they'd only hang me legal-like instead of here and now." Jake shook his head. I appreciate the optimism, Miss Clara, but I know Dobbs. I killed his brother in that card game. The confession hung between them like smoke. Clara felt the weight of it, the terrible mathematics of violence that had brought them to this moment, one death leading to another, revenge breeding revenge until the original sin was buried under layers of blood. Then we fight. The words surprised them both. Clara looked at the derringer in her hands, as if seeing it for the first time. Miss Clara. They'll burn the schoolhouse anyway, won't they, after they're done with you? She met his eyes. This is where I learned to read, Mr. Morrison, where my father taught before the war took him, where I hope to make a difference in the world. Jake studied her face, the high cheekbones made sharp by illness, the grey eyes that held steady despite everything. You're talking about dying for a building. I'm talking about dying for what it represents. She moved to the bookshelf, pulled down her father's copy of the Constitution. The idea that words matter, that education matters, that there's something worth preserving in this world besides might and violence. Pretty words don't stop bullets. No, but they outlast the men who fire them. Clara opened the book to the Bill of Rights, pages worn soft by years of reading. My students will remember what they learned here long after Sheriff Dobbs is dust. A gunshot cracked the morning air. Not aimed at them, just a warning, or maybe a signal. Time's up, Morrison, Dobbs called. Last chance. Jake looked at Clara, really looked at her, and she saw something shift in those winter eyes. The mask was slipping again, showing glimpses of the man underneath, the one who'd maybe been worth saving once upon a time. You don't have to do this, he said quietly. Neither do you. I chose my path a long time ago. Paths can change direction, Mr. Morrison. That's what makes them paths instead of graves. He almost smiled at that. You really believe that? Before she could answer, the sound of splintering wood filled the air. They were breaking down the door, done with talking. Clara raised her derringer, surprised by how steady her hands were. Beside her, Jake drew both Colts with the fluid grace of a man born to violence. Well then, Miss Clara, he said, and this time his smile was real. Reckon it's time for your final lesson. But as the first deputy burst through the door, gun blazing, Clara realized the most important lesson was just beginning. The first bullet took Deputy Williams in the shoulder, spinning him like a child's. Top, before he crashed into the reading corner, scattering McGuffey readers across the floor. Clara's derringer had spoken with surprising authority, and the shock on Williams's face was almost comical, until he screamed. Christ almighty! Jake stared at her with new respect. Where'd you learn to shoot like that? Sunday church picnics. Clara was already reloading, hands steady despite the chaos erupting around them. My father believed in practical education. 3 more deputies poured through the doorway, guns blazing. Jake's Colts answered in perfect harmony, filling the schoolhouse with thunder and smoke. The smell of gunpowder mixed with chalk dust, creating a bitter perfume that would haunt Clara's dreams, if she lived to have any. Deputy Mason fell first, Jake's bullet finding its mark center mass. The man's final breath escaped as a whistle. Through the gap in his teeth, the same sound young Thomas made when he was nervous. Clara pushed the thought away, forced herself to stay present in this moment where death wore familiar faces. Behind the desk, Jake shoved her down as sheriff. Dobbs himself appeared in the doorway, a mountain of rage and determination. The man's face was purple with fury, veins standing out like river systems mapped in anger. You killed my brother, you son of a bitch. Dobbs's shotgun boomed, taking a chunk out of Clara's desk that sent splinters flying like wooden shrapnel. She felt one slice across her cheek, warm blood mixing with the cold sweat of terror. Jake rolled, came up firing. His shot caught Dobbs in the arm, but the big man barely flinched. If anything, the wound seemed to fuel his rage, make him larger and more terrible. Going to hang you slow, Morrison. Going to watch you dance until your neck stretches. Have. To catch me first, Jake called back, though Clara could hear the strain in his voice. A dark stain was spreading across his shirt. He'd been hit and was trying to hide it. The remaining deputies, she counted 2 still moving, had taken cover. Behind the overturned benches. This wasn't going to be the quick, violent end she'd expected. This was going to be a siege, a slow grinding of wills, until someone made a fatal mistake. Clara crawled to where Deputy Williams lay groaning, his shoulder painting the floorboards crimson. Up close, she could see he was barely older than her. Brightest student, with the kind of soft features that suggested he'd never expected to use his gun for anything more dangerous than rattlesnakes. "Please," he whispered, "I got a wife, baby coming." The words hit her like a physical blow. She'd shot this boy, because that's all he was, really, a boy playing at being a lawman, and now he was bleeding out on the floor where children played. Jack's during recess. Shh. She pressed her handkerchief against his wound, applying pressure the way her father had taught her during the war. "You're going to be fine." But even as she said it, she could see the truth in his eyes. The bullet had done more damage than she'd intended, hit something vital. Williams was dying, and she was the reason why. "Miss Clara." Jake had crawled over, leaving a trail of his own blood. "We got to move. They're going to rush us." She looked at the derringer in her hand, then at the boy she'd shot. "I can't." "Can't what?" "I can't do this. I'm a teacher, not a killer." Jake's face was pale, whether from blood loss or something else she couldn't tell. Sometimes there ain't a difference. Before she could respond, Dobbs's voice boomed from outside. "Fire!" The world exploded. Flaming arrows arced through the windows, landing among the books and papers with hungry little hisses. Within seconds, the smell of smoke joined the cordite. And blood. And Clara watched in horror as her life's work began to burn. A copy of Hamlet caught fire first, the pages curling like dying leaves. Then her arithmetic primers, the poetry collections, her father's beloved volumes of Emerson and Thoreau, everything she'd used to build young minds into something better than the violence that surrounded them. No! She tried to reach for the burning books, but Jake caught her arm. "It's too late, we got to go." "Where?" "There's nowhere to run." Jake looked around the burning schoolhouse, at the books turning to ash, at the deputy bleeding out on the floor, at Clara herself with her face streaked by tears and soot. Something changed in his expression, some final calculation being made. Maybe there is. He stood, swaying slightly, and walked to the center of the room. Clara watched in amazement as he holstered his guns, raised his hands above his head. "Dobbs!" he called out. "I'm coming out." "Jake, no." Clara grabbed for him, but he was already moving toward the door. "Don't," he said quietly. "This ain't your fight anymore." "It became my fight the moment you walked into my schoolhouse." He turned back to her, and she saw something she hadn't expected in those pale eyes. Peace. The kind of peace that comes when a man finally stops running from who he is. "Maybe that's what I needed to learn," he said. "Maybe that's why I ended up here." The flames were spreading faster now, eating their way across the floor toward where they stood. Soon the whole building would be an inferno, taking with it not just Clara's books but any chance of survival. But as Jake walked toward the door, with his hands up, Clara realized something that made her heart race with more than just fear. This wasn't surrender. This was sacrifice. Jake stepped through the burning doorway like Daniel walking into the furnace, smoke wreathing his shoulders, like a dark angel's wings. Sheriff Dobbs waited in the schoolyard, shotgun trained on Jake's chest, face twisted with anticipation of long-awaited vengeance. Well, well, the mighty, dead-eyed Jake coming out like a whipped dog. Clara watched from the window, her heart hammering against her ribs. Behind her, the fire consumed her students' artwork, their careful drawings of farm animals and family portraits now turning to ash and memory. The smoke was getting thicker, making her cough, but she couldn't look away from the scene unfolding outside. "I'm unarmed, Dobbs," Jake's voice carried clearly across the yard. "Let the woman go. Your quarrel's with me." "My quarrel?" Dobbs laughed, the sound like breaking glass. "Boy, you killed my blood, my baby brother, and now you want to negotiate?" The remaining deputies flanked Jake, their guns never wavering. Clara counted 4 men still standing, plus Dobbs himself. 5 against 1, and Jake had walked out with empty hands. "Your brother was cheating at cards. You know it, I know it, and half of Dodge City saw it happen. Don't matter what he was doing. He was family." Dobbs raised his shotgun, and Clara saw Jake's death written in the set of the sheriff's shoulders, the way his finger tightened on the trigger. This was it, the moment when violence would claim another life, when the cycle would complete itself in blood. But then Jake did something unexpected. He smiled. "You're right," he said quietly. "Family matters, which is why I can't let you hurt her." Clara frowned, trying to understand. Behind her, the fire was spreading faster, eating through the floorboards where children had once practiced their letters. Soon the building would collapse, trapping her inside if she didn't move. "Hurt who?" Dobbs demanded. Jake looked directly at the window where Clara stood. "My wife." The words hit her like a physical blow. "Wife? What was he?" And then she understood. The marriage certificate in her desk drawer, the one she'd never used because consumption had stolen her intended husband before they could wed. Jake had seen it, must have grabbed it when she wasn't looking. He was giving her legal protection. In a world where women had few rights, a widow had more than a spinster. If he died as her husband, she'd inherit whatever small protections the law offered. It was a gift wrapped in lies, but a gift nonetheless. "You're married to the school marm." One of the deputies laughed. "Hell, Jake, you always did have a taste for the unusual." "Married 3 days ago," Jake said steadily. "Justice of the peace. In Abilene. You can check the records." Clara's mind raced. There were no records, of course, but it would take time to verify that, time she could use to escape. Jake was buying her life with his own, trading his blood for her freedom. The smoke was getting thicker now, seeping through the walls. She had to move soon, or the fire would make the choice for all of them. "Even if that's true," Dobbs said, "don't. You changed nothing. You still got to pay for what you done." "I know." Jake's voice was calm, almost peaceful. "But she don't. Clara's never hurt nobody, never done nothing but try to teach children how to read. Should have thought of that before you holed up in her schoolhouse." "Maybe, but I'm thinking of it now." Jake looked at the window again, and Clara saw him mouth a single word, "Run," but she couldn't move. Couldn't abandon him to face this alone, not when he was dying for her sake. The derringer was still in her hand, still had 1 shot left. From here, she might be able to— "Don't even think about it, Miss Clara." She spun around. Deputy Williams was standing behind her, swaying but upright, her handkerchief still pressed to his shoulder. His gun was in his good hand, pointed at her chest. "How did you— "Crawled through the back door while you were watching the show." Blood had soaked through his shirt, but his eyes were steady. "Figured you might try something foolish." Outside, she could hear Dobbs talking, drawing out the moment like a man savoring fine whiskey. "Going to hang you from that oak tree, Morrison. Going to let you dangle until the crows come for your eyes." "Just make it quick," Jake replied. "For her sake." Clara looked at Williams, saw something in his young face that gave her hope. "You have a wife, a baby coming." "That's right. What kind of world do you want that child born into? One where teachers are murdered for trying to save books? Where mercy is weakness and violence is the only language anyone speaks?" Williams's gun wavered slightly. "You shot me. To protect myself. To protect him. But I also tried to save you." She gestured to the bloody handkerchief. "Even after you came to kill us, I tried to stop the bleeding." "That don't mean nothing." "It means everything." Clara stepped closer, ignoring the gun. "It means there's still something worth saving in this world, still something worth fighting for besides revenge and blood." The building groaned around them, flames licking at the support beams. Soon the roof would collapse, burying them all in burning timber and ash. "Your child deserves better than this," Clara whispered. "Deserves to grow up in a world where teachers aren't afraid to teach, where books aren't burned by angry men, where maybe, just maybe, words really are mightier than swords." Outside, a rope was being thrown over the oak tree's lowest branch. Williams looked at his gun, then at Clara, then at the flames consuming everything she'd worked to build. "What do you want me to do?" Clara smiled through her tears, tasting smoke and hope in equal measure. "Help me save him." But even as she said it, they heard the rope go taut and Jake Morrison's final, defiant laugh echo across the burning schoolyard. The rope went taut, but it wasn't Jake's neck that bore the strain. Clara watched in amazement as Deputy Williams crashed through the front door, his wounded shoulder forgotten, tackling Dobbs around the waist, just as the sheriff kicked away the wooden crate beneath Jake's feet. The two men went down in a tangle of limbs and curses, the shotgun spinning away across the dirt. "Now!" Williams shouted. Jake's hands were bound, but his legs were free. He kicked hard, catching Deputy Mason in the gut, sending the man stumbling backward into the horse trough with a tremendous splash. The other deputies hesitated, confused by Williams' betrayal, and in that moment of uncertainty, Clara acted. She burst from the burning schoolhouse like an avenging angel, derringer blazing. Her shot took Deputy Carson in the leg, dropping him to the ground with a howl of pain. Not to kill, she'd learned her lesson about that, but to disable, to protect. "The knife!" Jake twisted against the rope, trying to reach the blade on Carson's belt. "Clara, the knife!" She dove for it, fingers closing around the handle just as Dobbs threw Williams aside and lunged for his shotgun. The blade was sharp, well maintained, and it parted the ropes around Jake's wrists like they were made of spider silk. "Behind you!" Jake tackled her sideways as Dobbs's shotgun boomed, the blast taking a chunk out of the oak tree where she'd been standing. They rolled together in the dirt, and Clara found herself pressed against Jake's chest, feeling his heart hammering against her ribs. For a moment that lasted forever, they looked at each other. His face was streaked with soot and blood. But those winter eyes were warm now, alive with something she hadn't seen before. Hope. "Why?" she whispered. "Because you were right," he said, "about paths, about change." Jake Morrison. Dobbs had reloaded, was advancing on them with murder in his eyes. "You think this changes anything? You think—" Williams' gun pressed against. The sheriff's temple stopped him mid-sentence. "It's over, Sheriff." The young deputy's voice was steady despite his wounds. "Drop the weapon. You're making a mistake, boy." "No, sir, I think I'm finally making the right choice." Clara helped Jake to his feet, amazed at how natural it felt to have his arm around her waist, her shoulder supporting his weight. Behind them, the schoolhouse was fully engulfed now, flames reaching toward the morning sky like desperate prayers. "All them books," Jake said quietly. "I'm sorry." Books can be replaced. Clara watched leaves of grass disappear into the fire, her father's beloved copy becoming smoke and memory. "People can't." Dobbs dropped his shotgun, but his face was purple with rage. "This ain't over, Morrison. Soon as I get back to town, you'll do what?" Williams kept his gun steady. "Report that you tried to lynch a man without trial? That you burned down a schoolhouse? Think the territorial judge will look kindly on that?" The sheriff's mouth worked soundlessly, the mathematics of his situation finally becoming clear. He'd overplayed his hand, let revenge cloud his judgment, and now he was the one facing questions he couldn't answer. "Besides," Clara said, pulling the marriage certificate from her coat pocket. Somehow Jake had managed to slip it to her during their embrace. "He's my husband now. Legal and binding, witnessed by Deputy Williams here." Williams nodded solemnly. Beautiful ceremony, real touching. Jake stared at the paper in Clara's hands. You don't have to, don't I? She looked at him, this outlaw who'd walked into her life like a storm and turned everything upside down. You were willing to die. For me, for books, for the idea that words matter more than violence. That was love. The word hung between them like morning mist, fragile but real. Maybe not the kind that starts with flowers and courtship, but love all the same. The kind that chooses sacrifice over safety. The fire was beginning to die down now, having consumed everything that would burn. Where her schoolhouse had stood, only blackened timbers remained, pointing toward the sky like the ribs of some great beast. But something else was rising from the ashes, literally. Clara walked to where her desk had been now just a pile of charred wood and melted ink. But there, impossibly, a single green shoot was pushing through the debris, a wildflower seed that had been scattered from the bouquet young Mary Elizabeth had brought her last week. Look, she whispered. Jake knelt beside her, his fingers touching the tiny green miracle. How is that possible? Fire clears the ground, Clara said, remembering her father's lessons about prairie ecology. Makes room for new growth. Sometimes destruction is just the first step toward something better. Williams had Dobbs and the remaining deputies lined. Up now, their hands raised. The young lawman looked different somehow, older, more sure of himself, like he'd finally figured out what kind of man he wanted to be. What happens now? Jake asked. Clara looked at the marriage certificate in her hands, then at the man beside her, then at the tiny flower pushing through the ashes of her old life. Now we build something new, she said. A school that teaches more than just reading, and arithmetic. One that teaches mercy alongside mathematics, forgiveness alongside phonics. And us? Clara smiled, tasting possibilities instead of smoke. Us too. We build us too. As if to bless their words, the morning breeze stirred the ashes, carrying them away to seed new growth in distant places. The silence that had started this day with gunfire now settled over them like a benediction, broken only by the sound of that tiny wildflower rustling in the wind. Jake took her hand, his calloused fingers intertwining with hers like they'd been made to fit together. Reckon I got a lot to learn about being a husband. Good thing you married a teacher. And there, in the ruins of her old life, Clara Whitmore Morrison began planning lessons for a very different kind of classroom, one where outlaws could learn to love, and dying women could teach the living how to truly be alive. If this tale of redemption and unexpected love stirred something in your heart, I'd be much obliged if you'd share it with folks who might need reminding that even the hardest hearts can learn to bloom again. Drop a word below about what lessons you've learned from life's unexpected teachers.